Steps to create a storyboard. All right, so here we go. I think that we're backwards on the screen, but that's okay. These will be available for you. Just listen to what I'm saying and jot down these notes. And like I said, the PDF will be available on the... Okay, all right, so hopefully you can see it. So here we go. Establish, create a timeline. Step number 1, okay? What is a timeline? How you create this is you read your story. On a separate sheet of paper, you have your story here, and on a separate sheet of paper, you start making notes. Okay? List the main events that happen in your story in the order that they appear in your story. So it might be, number 1, man wakes up in the morning in his house. That's the event, okay? Number 2, man brushes his teeth and gets ready for the day. Number 3, man is driving to work on the interstate. Number 4, man sees a spaceship coming down from the heavens. Step number 5, or event number 5, spaceship lands in the middle of the interstate. Event number 6, an alien appears coming from the vessel. Something like that. Now, out of all those events I just listed, each one of those are important to your story. But what do you think is probably the most eventful part of that? It would be the last one, right? The alien coming out of the spaceship. So what this does is it helps you to see what events are taking place in your story, the order that they come in, and what's most important, okay? What to illustrate over other parts, that kind of thing. Step number 2, and we talked about this for a minute. Identify key scenes of your story, all right? This is where you have to pay attention to the different elements of your story. The conflict resolution, what we call rising action, building up in the suspense or the action of the story. The ending, when you introduce a new character. All of these things are key scenes to your story, and you should have those highlighted on your list. Step number 3, you need to write a short description of what's going to appear on each page. So even though you have your events listed and you have your story beside that, on every page, write out a description of what's going to be on every page, okay? It may be something as simple as just pulling one of those events and saying, this is what's going to happen. So you want to pay attention to the setting here. If the setting's the same all throughout your story, and this is really important. Let's say you have a story that's taking place in a school library. The story opens up in the library, all the events take place in the library, and the story ends in the library. You have to think about interesting ways to draw the library on every page. If you draw a square box from the same, what we call perspective, then you know that might be less interesting than, say, drawing from a different perspective. And what I mean by that is, I'll flip ahead a little bit and show you. Perspective is like this. Here we have a square room. Now this is looking at it from front perspective. So you may have a table here, you may have a window, and a chair here, okay? So that's a room, right? And over here we could put a door. I want you to think about different ways to show that room in your artwork. You may decide to show it from an angle. You may decide to show the chair from an angle. What this does is it helps to break up the problem of having everything taking place in one location. Okay? Think about a movie. Think about the different angles that the camera's in. Sometimes it's looking down on the character. Sometimes it's at the floor looking up. Sometimes it's in a corner of a room, right? Sometimes it's looking in through a window. Think about these things while you're creating your storyboard. Okay? All right. Now, the fourth step here is to sketch each page in those small boxes or thumbnails that I showed you earlier. Rough sketch. It doesn't have to be too detailed. Basically, get all the information you can get in there, okay? Here's an example. So here's an example of a page layout for, let's say, a picture book, all right? We have basically stick figures, except I use circles. All right, over here we have a layout then of how you would draw the scenes in these thumbnails. All right, and out from the scenes, you have a description of each page, just what we've covered. All right, so you have little boxes, the rough version of what's appearing on the page, and then the description out from it. If you set it up just like this, when you start creating the actual work for your book, it's going to flow so much easier. Okay? Sometimes a publisher will say, we want our characters to appear in this certain way. We want X amount of pages. We prefer watercolor over paint, those types of direction. But typically, and this is probably 90% of the time, you have very minimal direction. Okay? So what my job is then to read this story, okay, and turn that into a picture book or a chapter book or a graphic novel. How that works is like this. I begin to read my story, and I'll block it off into what I think should appear on each page. And we'll use a picture book as our example. I'll read the first portion, and I'll get down to a certain point, and I'll make a mark on it, and I'll say, all of this part is going to appear on the first page. All of this will appear on the second page. All of this will appear on the third page, and so on and so forth. When you're creating your story, okay, you're at an advantage than what, let's say, I am as an illustrator working for someone else. Because you are creating your story, right? So while you're writing your story, you can start thinking about these things. Let's say you're going to use a picture book, for example, okay? Start thinking about what is going to appear on this page, okay? Let's pretend this is a page of your book right here. What is going to appear on that page? And you can also get really, really fancy with this stuff, because you know how a book opens out into 2 pages? You can take a book, pull it off the shelf, or pull it off your shelf at home. You open it up, and you have a left side and a right side, usually, right? Unless you're looking at the back cover or the front cover. You have a left side and a right side. So the pages connect like this, don't they? So you have 2 pages. See that? This part down the middle right here is the spine. So while you're designing your book, you can start thinking about stuff like, maybe I want to do an illustration of a countryside, and I have a road coming down like this. Maybe this is the first few pages of my book. And the road comes down like this, and then there's a hill coming up. And you can actually draw on 2 sides of your book, creating this vast landscape that your characters are going to be introduced to the reader in. This is the opening of the book. Here's a farmhouse up here with windows. Okay, and you can see how this sort of works. There's a porch here. There's the roof. There's mountains behind it. Okay, and the road's coming up this way. I asked you to look at different books that you're interested in last week and start to get an idea about what you like and what you don't like. So if you're going to do a picture book, I ask you to look at various picture books, remember? The reason I wanted you to do that is I wanted you to see how the illustrator places the different elements of their story on a page. So you can see how this works here, right? There's a house up there, and then there's a road coming up. There's mountains in the background. And this could be there's 2 different pages of my book, but those 2 pages can make up 1 illustration, right? One, what we call in the industry a spread, a 2-page spread, okay? You can create that in your book. Don't just think about 1 page to page and this illustration for this page, this illustration for that page. Be creative on how you place your artwork in your book, okay? Now let's talk about chapter books for a second. Chapter books, you're at an advantage, but you have to have a lot more words. You place illustrations throughout the book at different locations. How do you choose where to place an illustration? Now, typically, for a chapter book, you may want to place an illustration at the beginning of a chapter, obviously, right? So let's say this is 1 page of my chapter book, right? So I may put chapter 3 here, okay? And then I may have the illustration here. I may have an illustration here, all right? And let's say it's introducing this particular chapter, right? So we have a character that we're drawing here, and this character is holding a child, okay? And this is a illustration to introduce this chapter of our chapter book. But then we have other pages following that. How do you decide where to place an illustration in a chapter book? You remember those ingredients we talked about earlier? Anytime that you introduce a character, anytime that you have, let's say, conflict to arise, where there's a problem, anytime you move them from one setting to another or establish the first setting, all of these important ingredients, okay, are good opportunities in a chapter book to show what it looks like visually to the reader, especially the resolution. At the end, when the hero overcomes the protagonist, which is a big fancy word for villain, okay, and the hero overcomes the villain, or if they don't, hopefully they do, though, in our workshop, right? We want the heroes to win. But when that happens, that's a great opportunity to show that in a drawing, okay? Now we're going to talk about graphic novels, too. Graphic novels are becoming more and more popular with students. They are very, very, just a great method of sharing stories and language arts through a visual format. The graphic novels are very popular. Typically, a graphic novel will look like a standard comic book page, okay? Usually, it's what we call portrait. Do you remember we talked about that last time? It's more tall than it is wide, the pages. And let's say we're going to go ahead and draw another page onto here. On these pages, if you're creating a graphic novel, you have to have panels, right? And the panels are the boxes that are, what we said last time, that our action or our story takes place in, okay? You have to start thinking about how to position all of these panels and everything together. And you can start planning from the very beginning of writing your story. You can say, page 1, this is what's happening on page 1. Page 2, this is what's happening on page 2. So you know exactly what you have to put on those pages. But we started talking about all of this layout principles with storyboards. And I had to go ahead and talk about the different formats for a second, because your storyboard, how you create your storyboard, really depends on what you're creating. But this is what I want everybody to do as you're writing your story, okay? I want you to, first, you're going to draw boxes, all kinds of boxes on a piece of paper. Everybody, work on this for your story, okay? I'm going to draw these boxes, and what these boxes are going to represent are pages from my book. And I'm using a picture book as my example right now, because that's the fastest and easiest way. You can do this for a graphic novel. So here's a series of pages, okay? This is page 1, page 2, page 3, page 4, page 5, page 6. Okay? There's got to be more pages in this book. In each one of these boxes, we need to draw with stick figures, okay, what's going to be happening on each page. That's a storyboard. You have to determine what's happening on each page by your story. See how this all connects? So on page 1, you should know exactly what's going to be taking place. On page 2, you should know what's going to be taking place. And you start to sketch that out with stick figures. Okay, for the purpose of this, we'll say that, let's say a student is getting out of school. Okay, so I'm going to draw this stick figure with their backpack and a door behind them that's open. Okay, that'll be the school and some steps. All right, this is a basic outline of what's going to be appearing on my first page. Okay, it's a stick figure, and I need to know what's going to be happening on each page. So that's a storyboard. A storyboard is like the blueprint for your work, right? You will create your own storyboard, and you'll use your story to create it, so that before you ever start to draw on a piece of paper, you want to know exactly what's going to appear on that page before you start, okay? I hope everybody's clear on that. It's real important. Plan your book and know exactly what's going to appear on each page before you start, okay?